Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second event in the series on the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women that's being hosted by Equality Bahamas. We are really excited about this CEDAW Convention speaker series. We started it off last month with Patricia Schultz, who many people know from Switzerland, who is a former CEDAW committee member, and we're continuing today with a focus on Article 3, which looks at human rights, fundamental freedoms, and gender machinery, national gender machinery, which, as you know, if you've been following Equality Bahamas for a while, that has been a particular area of focus, and we've been using the hashtag building gender machinery. Today, we have the pleasure, the honor of being joined by Nigerian public policy analyst Esther Eghobamien-Mshelia, and she is an expert in this area. She has been focused on Article 3 as well as some other articles. I think she might tell us a little bit of some of her experience as a UN fellow. And we will be in conversation for a little while. She will present. We will make the slides available to you so that you can look at them later on. You can also pull them up on a larger screen if you wish while she is presenting, but she will be also sharing her screen, so you will see it here as well. We are live on Facebook. We are recording. Please feel free to join the conversation using the chat. If at any point you would like to chime in using your mic, please just raise your hand so that we can ensure that we don't have too much crosstalk happening in this space. Equality Bahamas extends lots of gratitude to CEDAW committee member, Bahamian lawyer Marion Bethel, who has been helping us to coordinate this series and identifying people who can speak to these articles in particular. She was not able to join us live today, but she did prepare an introduction to Esther. So I'm going to play that now, and immediately after, Esther will get us started with our look at Article 3.
Good morning, Equality Bahamas. Good morning to you, Alicia. It's so wonderful to be here with you. And to introduce my dear friend, Esther Eghobamien, to this Equality Bahamas series on the CEDAW Convention. Esther and I served for 2 years on the CEDAW committee together. And it was at this time that we became good friends. And I just want to very clear that Esther brought incredible energy, infectious energy to the committee, and an intellectual clarity and capacity on many of the issues that we were dealing with. Her passion was around digital literacy for women and girls in this digital era that we live in, and she certainly left her mark on that particular topic with the CEDAW committee. In addition to that, Esther is a maestro or maestress in regard to national women's gender machineries, and that is why I really thought she would be an excellent person to speak to us today on this particular topic. So Esther Eghobamien-Mshelia is a public policy analyst and social systems reformer with domestic, regional, and international experience in operations and processes across the social spectrum for transformative development, with grounded experience in gender policy analysis and initiation of targeted interventions. Esther is an international development consultant and former United Nations CEDAW committee member representing Nigeria as technical gender expert. She served on several thematic areas of the committee's work, including CEDAW UN Women and trafficking in persons and migration, and she strengthened the national women's machineries and others in regard to our work. Prior to joining the CEDAW committee, Esther led the country team and implementation of Nigeria's second national action plan, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, as the core team leader and UN Women National Technical Consultant, Women, Peace and Security. She retired as director of the Federal Civil Service in Nigeria and was appointed as the Special Assistant Technical to the Minister of Women's Affairs and Social Development, Nigeria. Esther was the interim coordinator, Federal Project Management Unit, World Bank supported Nigeria. She was also instrumental to the development and delivery of the National Gender Policy of Nigeria. Welcome, Esther, and thank you so much for being here with Equality Bahamas. And I know this is going to be a wonderful session. Thank you.
So thank you very much once again. And the session or the focus on Article 3 of the convention is particularly interesting to me because as head of gender for the Commonwealth, I had the privilege of working with a lot of female women ministers of women affairs, as well as ministers of other sectors. And then it started dawning on us in the Commonwealth Secretariat then, and for me as the head and subsequently the director, the peculiar challenges that national machineries faced and the chief executives, that is the ministers, and how we needed to find ways to strengthen them to be able to fully engage. And Article 3 actually is the article that actually lays out the demands of the convention in terms of fulfillment of women's rights across sectors. And so for this session, I'm hoping that as we set out, this engagement will enable participants to have probably a little more understanding of the core principles and concepts that are covered under the convention and the linkages with other sectors, all sectors, so that we can benchmark for accountability and then clarify the obligations of state parties, because sometimes when we're asking what the demands in sectors or that and national machineries be accountable to what? And so we do need to understand what the obligations of state parties are in terms of promoting and protecting women's rights. The other is to understand the intersecting nature and cumulative nature of rights, that rights violation in one sector could actually have a knock-on effect on other sectors, and therefore you do need a multi-sectoral approach. Rarely would you have a unilateral, monosectoral approach that would really resolve women's rights issues, because issues intersect. Health links with education, education links with infrastructure, it links with productivity, it links with access to resources and control over resources. So we constantly have to have a number of lenses on at the same time when we're dealing with gender issues. And that's what Article 3 of the Convention demands of all stakeholders, including state parties, and of course, civil society organization. And what kind of framework, the CEDAW framework of operations, how does CEDAW as a committee and the instrument set by the UN as a treaty body, how does it work, what does it consider, so that people can have an understanding of what can they do, at what point can they come on board, and if they do, what kind of tools do they need to make the post-recovery a little more equitable? And I share a few examples of those in terms of the CEDAW Knowledge Hub, which I was privileged to roll out while I was on the committee, and then the Effective National Women's Machinery framework, so to say, and the template, which I didn't add the template, but we can talk about that later. And so when we talk about human rights, really, what do we mean? Because a lot of people imagine that human rights, when we talk of women's rights, they just are things that came from the blues. No, they are tied to the fundamental human rights. So we've got to know that all human beings have what we call this bulb of human rights, which is there are 10 rights, with number 10, the right to life being the most fundamental. And the rest, you can see it on the screen: right to health, decent livelihood, social protection, identity, privacy, rights to be related to a family and to be parented, as well as access to justice and freedom of expression, rights related to bodily integrity. And sometimes when we talk about women's health and their right over their reproductive health rights, people think it's a violation, or why should women want? It's contrary to norms. I think the Universal Declaration which is what you have on the screen now, is that where did that come from? All of that bulb of rights actually are enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights of 1948. And it states clearly, explicitly, that every person, it didn't say whether you're a man or a woman, every person, every human is entitled to those rights. So those 10 rights and whatever is associated with them, all human beings are entitled to them, agreed to by all nations. Actually, it was the basis of the United Nations. But then where does CEDAW come in? And what do we need to know about the CEDAW? Because the CEDAW as a convention draws from the Human Rights Declaration on Human Rights. It's an instrument. It was adopted in 1979. For those who do not know, in 1979, it's an important agreement about the equality between women, girls, boys, and men. And it says that all discrimination against girls and women must end. And it seeks to address de jure, which is the law, and de facto, the reality of equality, because we often find that across the world, all constitutions now, I mean, maybe 22 years ago when I started working on gender issues, we didn't have constitutional guarantees in a lot of countries. But as of today, almost all countries in their constitution provide for equality. But the truth is, the provision is one thing, operationalizing that and putting it into practice so that for reality, de facto, women can actually enjoy those rights and live a life free from discrimination and stereotypes is a different ballgame. And Articles 1 to 16 of the convention covers all of these complex and interconnected rights. And in the committee and for women's rights, in the women's rights arena, we call them intersecting rights. And you would find that these rights and the articles, they actually align with other human rights treaties, both at the global level, at the regional level, like in Africa with the Maputo Protocol, in Europe with the Istanbul Convention, and I believe for the Caribbean and the Latin America, you have the Gender Plan of Action and your roadmap. These are things that mirror or are linked to the CEDAW Convention and provides like a framework, a reference point for us to know if we're really making progress. I took time to list out all of the articles, but I really will not be focusing on the articles today. I think we should look at Article 3, and I've highlighted it in green because it says take measures in the political, social, economic, cultural, and all spheres of life, in all spheres of life, institutional machineries to end discrimination against women. So you wonder, oh, do institutions discriminate? Yes, it's called systemic discrimination or systemic bias. And why should we be looking at Article 3 and why should we engage? Because a lot of people feel that after 40 years of the convention, there's just so much that's been done. And so what else do women want? But there is a real reason or rationale for us to be vigilant and to really embark on more constructive engagement based on Article 3. First, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic had gender dimensions. The response that we had across the world amplified gender inequalities and the near invisibility of women in national systems, be it the humanitarian system, the health systems, the social security systems. Women and men are not equally visible and do not benefit equally from those systems. And already we see that the recovery and all of the plans that were rolled out has a gendered outlook. The scope, the scale, the targeted beneficiaries. I know, like in my country, market women were not targeted as people that needed PPEs. They were not considered to be vulnerable. Although they were daily operating in markets or weekly in markets during the lockdown, exposed to people who could be carriers, who could be infected, and yet they did not get protection. And hospitals felt that reproductive care, antenatal care were not essential services. They were locked and shut. So women actually delivered at home. GBV referral centers that dealt with domestic violence were not considered as priorities. They had no passes to move around. They could not respond, and gender-based violence galloped to about 200%, at least in my country. And so the gender responsiveness of the recovery priorities, reconfiguration of the rebuilding plans, and the widening digital divide and the galloping shift to a global digital economy is why we really need to engage more constructively based on Article 3. And some statistics or information that might actually help us to know why financial exclusion, rights violation, and the unimaginably high levels of gender-based violence. An estimated 50 million cases were reported globally during the pandemic. A significant portion of that came from my country, and I believe from the Caribbean. And so we really need to ask ourselves, why is government, or why treaty duty bearers not responding to this level of cases? 50 million human beings or incidences is not something to sweep under the carpet. And interestingly, annually, if you calculate across nations, an estimated $12.5 trillion is spent on GBV management, from the reporting, the referral, the healthcare, the social care, the judicial services, the law enforcement. When you string all of that together, a lot goes to redressing gender-based violence, although there's no cogent or coherent action that is public-based, owned by governments, led by governments, and seen as a public demand. Weak or no social protection, undervaluing of women's work. About 740 million women are said to be in the informal economy. And these have their own issues of rights violation that they trigger. And dealing with the web of discrimination actually needs authority, power, reformed institution, legislation, technology, information, political will. And when we say political will, we actually and investment. And so if we know what is at stake, we need to really get to understand what the convention is all about, what the obligations are, and why we should take what relates to different sectors and engage with them so that we can actually begin to get explicit results across sectors. A lot of actors and stakeholders wonder why, what does discrimination mean? They think they know, but in terms of the convention, discrimination means unfair treatment of a person or group Yeah, we'll keep doing this. We'll keep
pressing on.
Yeah, we'll keep pressing on. We're not deterred. And discrimination against women and girls means either direct or indirect. You could actually have explicit discrimination or implicit discrimination. And treating girls and women differently from boys and men in a way that prevents them from enjoying their fundamental human rights, and which are universal. Okay, it's refusing to move to the next slide. So, okay. What do we mean by direct discrimination? I guess those are pretty things that happen on a day-to-day basis. They are different treatments that are quite explicit, that are meted out to either boys or women or girls, just on the grounds of their sex and because their gender is different. It could be gender-based violence, physical, acts that inflict physical, mental, or sexual harm, suffering, threats, coercion, deprivation of liberty, because sometimes in some regions, women need permission to go even to the hospital, to go take medical care. They need permission to undertake certain kinds of livelihoods. Any form of violence, exclusion from jobs, from events, from position, from clubs, these are actually all examples of direct discrimination as construed by the convention. What about indirect? Because oftentimes, like I said earlier on, discrimination can be implicit. That is, it could be a law that seems to be neutral. It could be a program that actually exacerbates or heightens existing inequalities, either because it fails to recognize structural barriers or because it fails to admit that there are differential needs, or there are systemic patterns, like in some countries, and I think up until very recently in Nigeria, a woman could not bail, could not take a bail for somebody who was apprehended, or a woman cannot apply for a passport, or very recently in my country, a woman cannot transfer citizenship, and we're still on that because it's something that's been a demand of women. It's yet to be resolved, but that's indirect discrimination because there are excuses for it, but there's really no basis for it. It's exhibited or committed by public or authorities. The convention actually lays out two kinds of prescription or views indirect discrimination from two angles. In terms of women's rights, demanding that women should be given protection against the occurrence of discrimination, and that there should be competent tribunals or public institutions who kind of mediate and ensure that sanctions and remedies are appropriated, they are provided, so that there's actually a place to seek recourse to women's rights violation. On the other hand, it prescribes for state parties their obligation to ensure that government bodies and organs are fully aware of the principles of equality. So ignorance is not an excuse. Once you've ratified the convention, there's an obligation on state parties who are members, who are state parties who have signed on and agreed to implement the convention, to ensure that governments at all levels, whether central, decentralized, once they're within their jurisdiction, they need to ensure that all are aware of the principles of equality and non-discrimination, and that they provide training, awareness, to ensure that officers and officials are equipped and skilled to be able to prevent and protect women's rights violation. Of course, I try to detail out for those who are not every day that the convention condemns discrimination in all its forms, and state parties must have immediate and continuous obligation. So it's not enough to just sign the convention. There must be ongoing effort to continue to disseminate the convention, to continue to put in place measures and to review them. And they also must proclaim to their population and the international community their opposition, total opposition to all forms of discrimination. But the question is, do they actually do this? And what should stakeholders be doing to ensure that this requirement or obligation under the convention is executed, particularly when it's decentralized into sectors, as Article 3 demands. And so in a summary, there are like 4 core obligations that are required, which really should be applying in the context of Article 3. The obligation to respect women's rights and to respect the convention, the obligation to protect women's rights, the obligation to promote women's rights, and then the obligation to fulfill, that is the things they are supposed to do, the training, the capacity building, the resourcing, because we will see down the line that these are actually the issues that constrain national machineries and constrain sectors from being able to deliver. Achievement of these duties are required in order to improve women's position and enable them to exercise right of de jure and de facto equality with men. I try to highlight, because sometimes state parties we tend to think it's all okay, and we don't really unpack what those obligations mean. And I took time for those who may not have engaged sufficiently with the committee, is that One, there's no direct or indirect discrimination, due diligence to prevent, investigate, prosecute, punish. And that's usually where we have a challenge, is that while most state parties sign on, that due diligence and the obligation not only to prevent, but to investigate, prosecute, and punish. That's really where the challenge is. And in doing that, state parties are expected to provide devolved authority. So state, local government, rural communities, the necessary financial, human, and other resources to be able to deal with the issues of protecting women's rights. And of course, they, as a state party, they retain the power to require full compliance. So the question that often comes up is, who is maintaining this compliance? Who has the power? Who is executing it? And how accountable are they? And we will see that down the line. They should establish permanent coordination mechanisms and provide safeguards. I don't know about the Bahamas, how many safeguards you have. And I don't know that the Bahamas is alone. I think most countries are actually still struggling with providing the safeguards that are needed. And so if we were to adjudge by Article 3 and the Convention, whether state parties are actually effective in implementing the Convention and specific articles of the Convention, three things that we will look at is, one, are they accountable to their citizens and other members of their community? Have they put in place the appropriate mechanisms, institutions, and resources? And do they review and report on their progress, be it self-reporting, independent reporting? What kind of review is undertaken? How effective is it? How detailed is it? And is it continuous? And as we do that, as we consider reporting, I'd like to share here what we call the fundamental principles, the principles of the convention itself. Because a lot of people imagine that when you talk de facto, de jure, there are three major intersections for the convention. We talk about formal equality, substantive equality, and transformative equality. And these are driven by whether you have the law, which is de jure, whether you have de facto, that is in actual access to rights protection and enjoyment of rights. And third is the social structure. If the law and the practice is okay, does it reflect in the society, in the fabric of society? And the elements that you use to assess and measure that are the equality of opportunities and results. Do we have access? Do we have the privilege? Is it evident? And the evidence is measured by transformative equality. Is society transforming? Are women more engaged? Are they equally represented? And these are all captured in what you call the CEDAW standards. These are enshrined in the articles, and we, of course, will elaborate a little bit more on Article 3, but there are general recommendations that detail out and spell out the critical equality thresholds that are vital in each of these areas, and they are reviewed regularly when state parties engage with the committee through what you call the reporting, the periodic reporting. We also have what you call the CEDAW jurisprudence. That is when efforts are made to interpret and resolve disputes through either individual communication or group communication on violation of rights. So the committee stands as an independent arbiter to interpret the standards of the committee and to ensure that there's adequacy of legal protection and other mechanisms to protect women's rights. And so when we imagine whether appropriate measures have been taken, some of the questions that we really want to ask are, what are the measures in place? Who sets the standards? For instance, in Bahamas, what measures are in place? Equality Bahamas, can you, at the tip of your fingers, list the kind of sectors, mechanisms, institutions, resources that are available in all sectors? That's what Article 3 talks about, all sectors. And who has set those standards and targets? Were they set by the sectors, or were they set by the national machinery, or were they set by the women's groups? Are they in line with CEDAW and other global frameworks? And do they lead to agency? Do they actually equip women and women's groups and women as individuals to have the competency, the proficiency, and the oversight to demand accountability? how can CSOs help? Because all of this means that we need vanguards, we need shadow reporting, we need target setting, we need coalitions, compliance monitoring, and sector-specific watch groups. Do any of those exist in Bahamas or in other countries? These are really the demands of Article 3. And here I try to take the human rights bulb and superimpose on it what Article 3, some areas of Article 3, with the most fundamental bill, the constitutional, judicial, and legislature. What kind of rights issues are enshrined within those? And then you see all of the different sectors and layers of life, women's rights and gender disparities in health, water, sanitation, security, education, environment, climate change. The list is endless. So the question is, how do we manage this intricate, because if there are women's rights in all of these that are peculiar to those sectors, how are we managing them? And for CEDAW, the pathways and how we operationalize it is straightforward, or seemingly so. The periodic reporting and shadow reporting is the opportunity to provide diagnosis. How do we diagnose discrimination that is in line with CEDAW jurisprudence in different sectors? It could be in mining, it could be in health, it could be in the rural areas, and what kind of legislation is in place, what policies, programs, any temporary special measures. These are all the things that Article 3 would consider. And I just gave an example, like we could look at multiple family law system. What does that mean? If there are various forms of families, what different versions or types of rights violation would that trigger? And if they're polygamous marriages or registered partnerships or de facto unions, what does it mean for women's rights? And of course, the economic aspects of family formation. Who owns assets? How are they transferred? What about inheritance? All of these are rights that are tied just to one stream. We're talking only of the family law system. And so on the basis of that diagnosis, CEDAW would issue general recommendations from time to time, elaborating the framework, the standards, the scope of articles to enable people get a better understanding of the landscape, what they really need to be addressing when engaging with a particular article. And of course, on the basis of the dialogue with the state parties, the constructive dialogue, concluding observations are issued to state parties to highlight areas where there seems to be need for urgent action, where there are concerns about women's rights violation, and subsequently there's a follow-up procedure system which seeks to track progress on the concluding observation called COBS, either within a period of 2 years or before the next 4 years when they are due back to report. And of course, side by side with that, the jurisprudence of the committee itself is set when individual communication is set, when persons feel their rights have been violated and there are insufficient legal, judicial, or constitutional mechanisms within their country to be able to address it. Of course, there are criteria for admitting individual communication, and we also have the optional protocol where there are groups of women feel that collective rights have been violated, and they demand inquiry so that they can seek remedy under the provisions of the convention where discriminatory practices are seen to be prevalent. Also, the committee operates through provision of technical assistance to state parties. This is done through mock sessions, it's done through engagement with the committee, seeking clarification, guidance, and working with experts who are on the committee. And here I actually try to introduce how the committee itself, and this was my proposition to the committee, in that in dealing with issues like with Article 3 or evolving issues of women, how do we provide that technical assistance through what we call the CEDAW Knowledge Hub? And that, is to seek that in between reporting procedures, how could we support state parties or stakeholders to engage? And if it uses a reverse technology model, which is 3 steps. First, there's an analysis, which is a diagnosis, prosecution, information sharing, review of the situation. Then it designs or redesigns the situation. What alternate strategies or modalities could be used or instruments? And then it seeks to implement within a set time frame how it would seek to achieve change and enhance women's right promotion. And so drawing on where you see the human rights treaty body strengthening, drawing on the resources of the CEDAW, like Equality Bahamas, working with the CEDAW committee, you could then go through a reverse technology to deal with an issue that is really priority. Let's say gender-based violence or the national machinery for women. If there's a challenge with the national machinery for women, what kind of analysis is needed? What kind of redesign do you require to make it more functional? And what implementation strategy is required? And of course, then you introduce innovation. What you need to change? How can you use technology? Continuous peer-to-peer learning. Who needs to learn? Who needs to be around the table? What multiple stakeholders need to be there so that we keep issues, we keep learning as we go. And then engagement and capacity strengthening. Of course, those who need to make the change need their capacity strengthened so that they can envision and redesign the work or the issues that they are engaged with. And of course, when that is done, you find out there's a better implementation, and some of the results would be better implementation of the standards, realizing what the CEDAW Convention lays out, visibility for CEDAW work, better benchmarking, accountability is increased. And of course, all of this should line up with the CEDAW processes. So you have the periodic reporting, you look at what the system, where is faulty within the different spheres of society. Could it be GBV? Could it be in the workplace, economic growth, procurement and contracts? Are we talking of gender procurement? Could it be in industry, agriculture? Or is it about the national machineries, as I mentioned earlier on? And then what kind of technical assistance to be able to get the results that we require and ensure that all stakeholders, which is what Article 3 actually talks about in all spheres of life. So how do we get all of those stakeholders to engage? And to deal with that, over time, while on the committee, working with committee members and an expert, we did a cursory review of national machineries over a period of, I think, about 15 years, and realized that a lot of national machineries were not functioning effectively. They were not too highly efficient in delivering or realizing the targets. And they were, the capacity needed to manage the complexity of dealing with multiple sectors was often not there, particularly in the context of Article 3. And so these 6 features, they are things that we identified as vital features that need to be present in a national machinery for it to be able to deliver. Autonomy and competency, how are they independent? Can they take decisions as an independent arm of government or part of an independent arm of government with the necessary legal instruments, either in the Constitution or the legislature, to be able to put budgets together, regulate, recruit, and provide public services? And if they have the autonomy, is the competency there to execute that mandate? Because it's one thing to have the autonomy, it's another to be competent to be able to do it. And the competency will be reflected in the level of authority and regulation that it's able to undertake. Does it wield authority with other sectors? Is it able to regulate other sectors in terms of the services they provide to protect women's rights? And if it's to do that effectively, is it able to collaborate and coordinate? Because multi-sectoral issues need joint approaches, and that needs coordination. Is the machinery able to do that? And if it's able to do that, how accountable is it? Is it accountable to stakeholders, to the beneficiaries, to the law, to interest groups? And does it have a compliance regime? How does it ensure that the regulations and the systems and services are actually executed? Shelters are set up. Who monitors to ensure compliance with agreed standards? Services are provided by law enforcement agencies. Who ensures that women's peace security interventions meet the required standards? Resources and financing. Of course, without finances, not only for staffing or for workshops, but for actual provision of critical services, rapid response. Do we have rapid response services to issues in national machineries? Do we have follow-up mechanisms, spot checking? Do we have visits, to communities? Who resources that? And of course, to wrap that up is a system for monitoring, evaluation, impact assessment, and continuous reporting. But what we find is, what we try to do is to weight these different features so that we can actually assess, so that a country or a national machinery is not only good on autonomy and competency, we've added weight. So you would see coordination and oversight is weighted 20%, while authority and regulation, its capacity to regulate, is given another 20%. So 40% of the work of a machinery should be about coordination, oversight, the authority, and regulating services that promote and protect our women's rights. And then, of course, you have 15% each allocated to accountability and compliance, autonomy and systematization, are they able, and the competency, financing and resources, and then monitoring and impact. So if you were to assess the national machinery in the Bahamas, what would be the score on each of these pies, this component of the pie? Out of these 6 features, are they present in Equality Bahamas? Are they present in the national machinery of any country? And if they are not, what do we need to do? And so as I wrap up this session, some of the questions I will be leaving with the group, or I hope we can deliberate on, is how well do we know Article 3, the CEDAW articles, particularly Article 3, and its relevance to women's advancement in different sectors? Which features of the national machineries are available in the Bahamas or in any other country or in any other state party to enhance accountability and compliance with CEDAW Article 3 standards and principles, so that we can actually better harness women's human capital resources? What can you do? From where you stand, Alicia, Equality Bahamas, what can you do? And are there any foreseen challenges? What kind of technical assistance or partnership is needed for you to be able to overcome these challenges? And I do have on my own website, my personal website, a tool which is called the CEDAW Compliance Tool. It assesses institutions and individuals at the personal and professional level. I can make it available on request. I thank you very much, Alicia, and I hope we can have a good conversation on how to better deliver accountability to Article 3, working through improved national machineries, coordination, and collaboration around gender equality. Thank you very, very much, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Esther, for an excellent presentation that really put Article 3 into context for us. I think when you read Article 3, I just put the text in the chat so people can kind of get a sense of what the article itself says. You see that it's pointing to basic human rights and fundamental freedoms, but not necessarily, what that means. What does that obligate the state to do? And I think right up front, you made it really clear that this is really about having systems in place to ensure that rights are not just acknowledged, but protected and promoted and then fulfilled. I think that's the part that we leave out a lot of times. I'm really glad that you had that 4th point of fulfillment of women's human rights and the importance of having a national gender machinery. And as I mentioned earlier, this is something that Equality Bahamas has been talking about for a while. And we've been thinking about that question that you asked, what can we do? Because you can feel really stuck when you're just, in civil society, you're running an NGO, or you're an individual activist, and you look to the government to do everything. And when it isn't doing everything, you wonder, where do I fit in? What's something that we can do about this? So that's really where this session on CEDAW came about. We thought, if we equip people with the tools, we help people to understand some of these mechanisms, then we can start to relate it to our own lives. But even in having that conversation, we're thinking about government entities, we're thinking about this national gender machinery and what that should actually look like. Do you have a country in mind that you can point to say that this country has a functioning national gender machinery, or maybe an ideal of what that looks like in terms of structure and the activities that they undertake?
Are you asking that of me, or you're asking that of the Bahamas?
Yes, I'm asking that of you. I'm asking, should we be aiming for? What do we need this? Right now we have a Department of Gender and Family Affairs. What should that look like? Should it be a department, or should it be something else? And what are the activities that it should be undertaking right now?
Well, you see, Article 3 of the convention actually draws or builds on I think it's paragraph 121 of the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategy that requires and requests state parties to set up machineries at the highest level of government. And so when you talk of a national machinery, it should be a machinery set up to engage the political leadership and the policy makers at the highest level, engage our cabinet, because our cabinet is where decisions are taken, particularly across sectors. Sometime in the past, and this was probably about 20 or 18 years ago. In Nigeria, we actually shut down the agricultural policy because the policy was completely gender blind. It didn't recognize women as farmers, and women constitute about 65% of rural farm labor in Nigeria. And in the draft that was taken to cabinet for approval, there was no segment that recognized the role of women as farmers. That's to show you the vital role of having the national machinery have a leader who sits at cabinet, because then when sectors bring up their policies, their projects, that national, the minister who sits at cabinet should have the capacity and the technical support to be able to understand the gender issues in the different sectors, because that's really what Article 3 demands. And so if it's not a minister, I mean, I cannot imagine a director walking up to the Minister of Transportation or the Minister of Aviation or Industry and saying your policy is wrong. You know, you would need somebody of a peer, and you saw that in the CEDAW Hub. You talk about peer-to-peer learning. There's a place for peer-to-peer relation, because you would need a minister to be able to relate to a minister and say, we have concerns. Otherwise, the platform for engagement would actually not even exist. So you wouldn't even be talking of preventing or fulfilling or upholding. So in order to be able to promote, protect, you need to have that mandate and that positioning within the architecture or structure of governance. A minister, full-fledged minister with equal mandate as other ministers, which means they can then have the legitimate authority to ask questions and raise questions and say, I'm sorry, you've put together an industrial strategic plan for the country, probably a 20-year plan, but it doesn't recognize women, who are like 50% of the population. And so that's the real relevance of that position of the minister, is to ensure that all of the technical skills, all of the data, the evidence is utilized at cabinet level to ensure that policies across other sectors actually reflect the gender concerns and seek to bridge gender disparities. And so you would need a minister, and then of course you would need a department, because if you don't have a department, then you do not have professional or technical staff who would be able to deliver. And the question then comes to the issue of competency, is that if there are staff there, what is their competency to be able to deal with issues, for instance, in the oil and gas or in energy? Do you have anybody who is an expert? Or to deal with macro economic issues? Is there anybody who is an expert on monetary and fiscal policy or on trade? Because if you don't have that kind of expertise and people who can engage with that sector, the gender expert or the gender ministry will just be an observer, because or at the best you just say, oh, women are violated, or women's rights are not upheld. What specific rights? You heard the words when I was using, I was careful. I was talking about explicit and implicit. There are a lot of implicit rights violations across many sectors, laws and policies that are presumed to be neutral, but that are not. And some are presumed to be protective of women, but they're really not protective of women. They erode their liberties and their ability, to access productive opportunities. So we've got to consistently have that careful balance and the capacity to engage that sector. probably 20 years ago, I mean, some 25 years ago when I started gender work, we didn't have the data. We didn't have data on women and gas and oil and gas. We didn't have data on women and aviation, or women and industry, or women and procurement, or the value chain in many sectors. But today it's not so. We even know the added value of diversified boards, that boards that have men and women outperform single-sex boards by 33%. I mean, that's a lot for the bottom line, even if you're in the private sector. We know that private sector companies who engage women and men and give them equal space to contribute their creativity, they have a higher profit margin. So what then is the basis for discrimination and exclusion? I mean, if it's in terms of economic growth, that argument is not there. And so, but then you need to engage at the right levels. And so if you do not have people positioned with the skills, the competencies to engage, if you do not have a compliance monitoring system, who is going to monitor and ensure that the standards and the services they provide in that sector are pro-gender or respond to gender issues? That's the work of the national machinery. Because you cannot expect other sectors to self-regulate at all times. Even if they did, there should be independent, spot checking to ensure that the reports that they send in actually reflect the reality on ground. Otherwise, women's views and their concerns will just continue to drown, in the stream of issues that are dealt with at professional level in different sectors. And a lot of them, I dare to say, are not deliberate. It's because these things have been systematized over time, and we need to break down those systemic barriers, address them, and propose innovative ways of achieving the issues that we need to achieve.
Thank you so much. So that means that the structure is critical to the function of the gender machinery. We do need to have it at the ministerial level, because that way the person with responsibility for this entity is actually in parliament, in cabinet, and able to influence the policies and the laws that are put forward and the reform that is undertaken.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I see we have a question from Moju Bailo. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, I think the structure is essential, but it is not the only thing that's needed. I mean, I know you didn't say that was the only thing needed, but the political will to engage the kind of transformative change that taking seriously the CEDAW Convention would mean is important. And some of the political will, the ways in which political will be signaled is by adequately resourcing the national political machinery in terms of budgeting, in terms of also the personnel that are detailed to have, to do the work in the bureaucracy of that machinery. And well, I'm Nigerian, so I'll talk about Nigeria. The US hasn't even, I live in the US, and I don't think the US is a signatory to CEDAW, okay. So that is a problem in itself, because I think the US is looked upon as a leading light often in international affairs. And then you wonder why it wouldn't sign the CEDAW Convention. But in terms of Nigeria, it's admirable that there's a ministry. It's admirable there's a minister. I think, the ministry is not functioning as well as it could because of this resource lack and the lack of political will on the part of the general government, the central government, to put teeth and muscle in the implementation of the requirements of the convention. And so having this nice charts that you're talking about from minister to minister is very nice, but it wouldn't do anything. Another thing is, to what extent are ordinary women aware that there's a CEDAW convention? To what extent do they know what it should mean to them and how they could use it to better their lives? This is my own frustration with a lot of conventions and declarations and all these things. They're supposed to be for the people, but the people don't know anything about them. So if they're not popularized and made digestible, and if there's no effort to kind of do the ground level work of consciousness raising, it's just going to be a talk among experts who all speak the same language, and putting cosmetic changes in place that don't really do that de facto kind of change in terms of how women experience a lot of the discriminations that they face in their day-to-day lives. So it's more of a comment, but I'm wondering what your response is.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kume. Yeah, a lot of things you say are the reality, and the truth is, it's not only Nigeria or the Bahamas. The challenge that we find is the insufficient political will to put in place the proper architecture. I was sharing with Alicia before we started here that in the work, some of the work that I'm doing right now, I'm calling it a tale of two cities, because you can go to a Ministry of Health. I mean, the health systems may be dysfunctional, but you can actually identify clear services, clear competencies that are needed to deliver the work. And you can know at least what is required and expected of those ministries. Well, knowledge and popularity of the CEDAW Convention is the work of the national machinery for women, but it needs to understand that mandate, and not only to understand that mandate, to have people who have the competency to speak to issues, because it gets uncomfortable if somebody begins to talk now about automation and about artificial intelligence. I tell you, the minister or the ministry will not be comfortable. Why? Because there are no experts. The place has not been sufficiently professionalized for it to be able to respond to the issues the way it should. And that has implications for resourcing, because government, as a public institution, the function of the public institution is to render public service. So what public service? What service to what constituency besides advocacy and workshopping? And I can tell you, Professor, that community of research by INSTRO as at 2018 shows that gender training has not been effective. There has been tremendous investment in gender training globally, but you do not see the commensurate effect. It's not applied in the place of work. Why? Because there's no compliance mechanism. There is nothing tied to the gender training. It is all I'm looking for the right word to use. It's like it's just glossing over and telling people you do need to understand gender, but you have no obligation. There's no obligation to deliver and to deploy those skills, and it's not tied. There are no sanctions. There is not tied to performance. And so if people go for gender training, so what happens? But the question is, who should create that atmosphere? Who should create the regulatory framework? It starts with the national machinery. So first things first is that the national machinery itself needs to wake up and recognize itself as a public instrument or structure that should regulate, that should license some services, that should hold people accountable, and when need be, advocate. But I bet to say right now, most national machineries, as they come before the committee, 85 to 90% of their work is advocacy. Programming is left to other sectors who determine what the targets are. Most policies, national gender policies, have no targets. There are no National Technical Advisory Council in country that sets the direction and says this is what is priority for this country in the next 10 to 20 years. So if it is not seen as a profession, and anybody who wakes up and it feels hurt about women becomes a gender activist, takes a microphone and says whatever, whether they know the CEDAW standards or not. So it is all of those systematization that is lacking, that sometimes translates to no political will, because you cannot put, I mean, if you have a minister of education who does not know what the curriculum of the country is, or that there are standards and procedures, there will be a challenge. In the national gender machinery, how has government envisaged that role? And when I say engaging with ministers, I'm not talking of a pally, of I know you are, you are my body. We're talking about official communication. You write officially. I gave the example of when we brought down the agri policy. That policy was sent back with the instructions, go and sit with the Ministry of Gender and work it out, so that the Ministry of Gender can actually tell you these are the gender issues in that agri policy that need to be brought to light. But you see, when the machinery has gone on for so long, it cannot, or he has not sufficiently engaged with sectoral policies to be able to say, these are the targets there, these are the issues that need to be transformed, and this is what women want to see. That takes a level of professionalism that is often lacking. And so it appears as lack of political will. When the professionalism is sufficient, then the political will, then you can start demanding for resources. Right now, the resources that are given to most national machineries go for workshops. It's not that they don't have budgets at all, but what are the substantive transformative things they have been able to generate that then attracts more? Because public budgeting system is often performance-based. So if your performance is number of workshops organized, so you will keep organizing workshops. You've had 50 over the past 2 years or 5 years. How many more workshops are needed to really begin to address women's rights? Workshops are essential, but do they really bring transformation? Can we measure it? Advocacy is good, but can we correlate the impact of that advocacy? In certain instances, yes, but the question is, what is the effectiveness? At what unit cost? If you need to advocate and visit the parliament 50 times, paying for transport, bringing women from different locations, and at the end, the bill gets thrown out like in Nigeria, what is the cost effectiveness? And so those are the issues we really need to get into the nitty-gritty. But the first thing is having a structure, clear mandate, professionalizing it, knowing the kind of services they should be doing, and what they need to engage with different structures or different sectors on. And not thinking that national machineries are women NGOs. They are not. They are not a civil society outfit. They are government entities set to hold accountability at different levels. Are they doing that? What is required to deliver that? That, I think, are some of the questions. You've raised them, but I think I'm just throwing a little bit more light to say, yes, those key features that I mentioned, if they are there, to what degree? And then you begin to say, where do we put our best foot? Do we focus on autonomy? Because in many countries, the agencies are not even autonomous. They don't have the autonomy. They cannot issue any statement. They cannot produce policy. They have to work under another minister who has maybe 10% time for them of the whole year. And in some, they are just directorates or units that have nowhere do they get near cabinets or multi-sectoral work. And so those are necessary first steps, is that you create that machinery and then you define it well. And then you professionalize it. You set up the service delivery spectrum, so to say, of that institution. And then you begin to identify the professionals that are needed to deliver on each area. Then you equip them, and then you set your compliance mechanism.
So many great points and so many questions that I think we've been struggling with this whole time, right? It's why we're not where we need to be yet, because we're trying to balance all of these ideas of what the structure is like, what the function is like, who are the people who are there. And that comment about trainings, doing workshops, it's important. It's important to build the competency of people, but what is the outcome, particularly when the people who are being trained don't actually care? They're there because they have to be, or because they happen to work in this particular office, but fundamentally, they believe something different. They don't understand gender. They don't care about gender. They don't think that people of different genders have different needs, different experiences, and we get stuck because then they have the information, but no motivation to move forward. And so it comes back to this question of political will and how we build it. And I can say for Equality Bahamas, one of the things that we've been focusing on is equipping people with the tools, like I said. So having these sessions, making it more accessible to people so they can get a better understanding of what these mechanisms are. Because we get out there in public and we speak to the government and we talk about CEDAW and Beijing and Balam Dupara, but members of the public are sitting there like, what are you talking about? And we can't get their support unless they understand what we're talking about. So I think that's the beginning of sort of building the ground and building political will so that the people, community members actually join us in calling for what we need. Not that it's a magic fix, right, or precise formula, but recognizing that it's not just about NGOs and it's not just about waiting for governments to do something, but actually mobilizing people and organizing on the ground. I saw that we had a couple of questions as well in the chat. I think we can talk about this all day, but we're at time. So I just want to give you these last two questions, Esther, if that's okay. This one came in the chat. When a state has not signed the optional protocol, what recourse do individual women have to hold the state to account?
Well, when states have not signed the optional protocol, that doesn't debar women from approaching the committee to express violation of rights and asking for interpretation. All it means is that the national legal system, the judicial system, law enforcement system, the government of that state party has said it will not hold itself to CEDAW standards. But we've had cases where the optional protocol is not endorsed and they still come to the committee because they are state parties to the convention. And maybe what they will not do is they will not respond to demands for submissions to the committee. But then because they are under obligation to the convention itself, then they will be held accountable on the basis of the convention proper.
And we will have a session just talking about the optional protocol later on. We're going slow. We're going month by month, one article at a time. So that will be 2023 when we have that conversation. But just stay tuned and you will know when we get to the optional protocol in our series. And the last question that we got in the chat before we got into that great discussion a minute ago, how can climate change and its impact on women's rights be incorporated into the work of CEDAW?
Well, actually, the committee has already, like I said, Article 3 talks about all spheres of life. So the committee itself actually has a statement on climate change reduction and disaster risk management. It's available on the CEDAW website, and significant work has been done by a lot of committees, and the committee works with the disaster management group of the UN to look at the gender dimensions to disaster risk reduction and climate change management. And so it's an ongoing process. Women need to stay engaged. There are publications in my country, Nigeria. There's actually a gender action plan on climate change for COP21. And that's because the gender group who focus on environmental issues and climate change work together with government to articulate a strategy on what women would like to see. And so I would encourage other states to do the same. Do it in energy, do it in oil and gas, do it, in digital technology, which is an area that I'm really, really interested in. And I'm hoping we can work together and put together a framework, a general recommendation that speaks to digital technology and the economy, digital economy, because issues of automation, issues of robotics, issues of the blockchain and all of the NFTs, these are creating emerging and new forms of discrimination against women that we need to sufficiently address before they roll out. And then we start, at the bottom of the ladder again, trying to deal with exclusion, bias, and discrimination. And of course, women's livelihoods are the most threatened in all of these changes that they portend. And we're not saying no to automation. I don't oppose automation. All we're asking is alternate livelihoods, alternate employment for women who will get impacted so that they don't end up on the unemployment bench.
Thank you for that. And yes, CEDAW is looking at some areas that aren't explicitly spelled out in the convention. I know we saw in our concluding observations in 2018 that climate change was addressed, and there was a call for example, I think the representation of women in decision-making processes regarding disaster risk reduction and post-disaster management. So we are seeing that. And I think NGOs, of course, in shadow reports can raise the issue and particularly note some of these intersections like climate change and disaster and gender-based violence, for example, which has been something that we've been talking about in the Bahamas following Hurricane Dorian in 2019. So we are at time, and that kind of went by quickly, right, everybody? Luckily, we have the slides that you can go through at your own pace and think about them some more. They're available at tiny.cc/CEDAW Esther. So we've made it easy for you to find, tiny.cc/CEDAWESTHER. You can look at those slides. And
perhaps we should share that in the chat box,
yes,
to everyone, so people can copy and use it well.
Yes, we've shared it in the chat a couple times throughout the session. We will also post it on our Facebook page, facebook.com/equality242. And everyone who's registered for this session will receive the recording as well as the slides. So if you're already here, don't worry, it will show up in your inbox over the next few days. And Esther, thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation about Article 3 and CEDAW as a whole. I think it's really helped to ground us in the article and CEDAW more generally to understand how it can actually be operationalized and what we should be looking for from our states once they've ratified. The Bahamas is coming up on its 30th anniversary of ratification, and that is the reason for this series. So we're doing one article per month. We'll also be looking at a couple of general recommendations and the optional protocol up to October, when we'll be acknowledging the 30th anniversary. Our next session will be the third Saturday in June. I believe it's June 18th at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So Nassau time, 10 a.m., 9 a.m. Jamaica. And we will be with Gaynell Curry, who is a human rights expert, Bahamian, who has worked at the UN for many years as well. And we're really looking forward to hearing from her about Article 4 on special measures. And we'll probably have a lot of conversation about political quotas, which we desperately need. We need to talk about that and what that looks like. So thank you again, Esther, for joining. Thank you everyone for being here with us and for sharing your questions and comments with us. If you think of anything later on that you want to share, feel free to email us, equalitybahamas@gmail.com. We're also happy to share any communications that you want to send directly to Esther. And again, thank you
very much, Alicia. And I look forward to working with you and UN Women in the Caribbean to try and see if we can get some model national women's machineries that other countries can probably replicate, emulate, adapt, because there are conversations going on around that already.
Absolutely. Looking forward to being in touch with you, Esther, as we move forward.
Dear. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Marion.
Have a lovely weekend. Thank you for the invitation. Great being here. Thank you. And thank you everyone for the comments and for the feedback. I appreciate it.